Cool, thanks for joining. I just wanted to give a walkthrough of what we've got today for security policies, and then also cover some of the plans we've got for our roadmap. And then Andy, I wanted to sync up with you on related plans in GitLab for fine-grained permissioning, because eventually we actually see all of this coming together. So as I mentioned in Slack, right now we're storing all of this in a security policy project. We've really designed this from the beginning to be able to go into the database. And that's really where we want our storage to be, like in the long-term vision, is in the database, which means we will need to have, GitLab will need support for fine-grained permissions elsewhere in order to keep feature parity with what we've got today. But there were a lot of reasons for putting it in a linked project. Iteration was a big part of that, because right out of the gate, we just automatically have a full history of all of the policy changes. We automatically have segregation of duties, because you can manage your maintainers for the security policy project separately from the maintainers on the development project. And you automatically have the ability to require two-step approvals for any changes to the policies, which is also a big deal. You don't want to let just one person unilaterally change the policy. Usually policy changes themselves have to go through an approval process. So there are a lot of things that we got just for free out of the box by doing it this way. That being said, we are doing our best to abstract away the fact that these are stored in a project, because the user experience really shouldn't be about where the storage layer is, whether it's the database or a Git repository or something else entirely. That's really not where we want our focus to be. We really want the focus to be on just building the policy. That's what the user came to do in the first place, not worry about how and where it's being stored. So with that preface, I'll just share my screen here real quick and give you a quick walkthrough. So on this project, I'm an owner. And actually, let me come up here to a project that doesn't already have a security policy project. So I'm an owner on this one. And if I come into policies, you'll notice the blank state here says this project doesn't contain any policies. I can go and I can come in here and I can click edit policy project, and I can choose that manually in the UI. I can go through and search and find one, or I can just dive in and create a new policy. And part of this workflow is because we have network policies as well, which those are not stored in the linked security policy project. So that's a whole nother thing. We don't have to dive into that today. But because we have these other types of policies that don't require a policy project to be linked first, we had to develop the workflow around that. But as an owner, I can come in and I can just right away, I can create a scan execution policy. I don't have to worry about where the storage is. I don't have to think about it. As soon as I click create via merge request, that's actually going to create a new project for me. It's going to link that project back here, and it's going to open this as a merge request in that newly created project. So it's going to do all of those things behind the scenes so that I don't have to worry about them as a project owner. If I'm not a project owner, and yeah, let me come over here for just a minute. So on this project, big GitLab org project, I'm not an owner, and we don't have any security policies yet. So I can still come in and click new policy, because I might be creating a network policy. And again, network policies are stored directly in the Kubernetes cluster. And so I can still go ahead and do that. I don't need a security policy project as a prerequisite for that. But if I come in, I click scan execution policy, that's where I get this blank empty state saying that it can only be created by project owners, and it links out to our docs. So again, once network policies go away, this empty state, we'll be able to move that over onto the main policy page, because all of the policy types will require a linked policy project. So the new policy button can go away, and then this can just direct you straight to contacting your project owner, if that makes sense.
Hey, Sam, quick question. So if I am creating a new policy as the project owner, it is basically turning that project into a security scan policy project,
No,
right? Like, oh, it's not. Okay, so it's not placing that
no,
in that project?
creates a new project for the
Okay,
project. So that way you've got separation of duties so that you can manage your maintainers on the security policy project separately from the development project. So it actually creates a new project inside of GitLab. And then it's the same as if I had gone and created a new project and then come in here and found that project and linked it up. So that way you've got two projects and they're linked to each other.
gotcha. What is it called? Is it like an auto naming based on their current project name or something?
I don't remember what our naming convention is. It's, I suppose we could try this out. I don't want to.
I know, I admittedly should have played with this myself. I know what's gonna do.
As soon as I click create via merge request, right, because I don't have a name. A required dast. That should work. Okay, so create a corporate website security policy project. So there you go on the naming scheme.
Does it just nest within the nearest group folder?
Yep,
Subgroup?
put it in that same group that the other project was in. So you'll notice now we've got corporate website and corporate website security policy project. And there's the description, right? It was automatically generated. So one of the really nice things about this linking mechanism, though, is that you can have, it supports one-to-many. So this security policy project is linked to this corporate website, but I can also link it up to other projects like this data generator or mobile app. Like I could have this one set of policies apply to 2 projects, 3 projects, 10,000 projects. We have an API call that does that linking. So if you want to go through and programmatically apply one set of policies to everything in GitLab, you could do that.
Would that only be in respect to the projects within the nested group, or could it be external to other groups as well?
It can be external. There are no requirements there.
That's amazing.
Yep. So that piece is really nice. You know, again, a huge benefit that we got just by virtue of going with the storage in Git. So again, we'd like to move it all to the database. We're planning on that, but it's a little bit more of a long-term roadmap item for us. So hopefully, Justin, did that help answer your question about the empty states and the workflow there?
Yeah, for sure. Thank you.
So I did want to highlight a couple things we've got on our roadmap. And right now, so you notice any changes, it basically turns into a merge request into that linked project at the moment. One thing we've got on our roadmap is to make this those items show up all in that policy page. So right now, this policy page will only show you policies that have been committed into the default branch, but we're planning to surface up any policies that are pending, like pending via MRs, so that you can see those there and action on them and approve them without having to jump out to that separate project. Because right now that workflow is a bit disruptive and it's kind of confusing. But you know, here you could open this up and you can see like here, this one's been committed in, and here's like the history, and you know, we've got all of these pending changes and which one do I want to go approve. So that's one area that we want to clean it up. Obviously, we'll have to have all of this UI and workflow here within the policy page before we get rid of the linked policy project, because you still need that method somewhere, somehow to approve the policies. So again, we're in the iterative way that we're handling this, we're building out that UI here so that you'll be able to handle the approval within the policy page instead of having to jump out to that external project. Or at least this is a first step in this direction. There's still no like approve button here. It still would take you out to that merge request, but just starting to surface this up, and eventually we'll provide like an approval workflow that's all self-contained in this policy page.
Sam, do you see long-term keeping it backed with some sort of configuration file in the Git repository, or are you looking to store these policies in the database as well?
So we're looking to actually store them in the database, but we will keep the concept of security as code. So we're very deliberately storing, we've got the rule editor mode, and then we've got the YAML editor mode. And so that YAML basically just will just map to a database schema and vice versa. So they can still edit these as YAML and view it as YAML, even though it'll be technically stored in the database. So the goal is just to abstract out the backend storage layer. It shouldn't matter to the user where these are being stored, but regardless, the fact is that they're managing these policies as code. And where we happen to place it for storage purposes, that's not really pertinent to the user experience, or it shouldn't be.
Yeah, no, I agree. I was actually kind of coming from a slightly different angle from some feedback from a customer yesterday. The person he was a security team lead or whatever, and he was expressing his frustration with having to go down into YAML so much. And he wanted a very, GUI version of things, and said, YAML, that's fine for developers, but please don't make me do that. So it sounds like regardless of whether it's backed by YAML or a database, you're going towards UI parity with everything that you could construct.
Exactly. I mean, from our research that we've done, and we did like a whole problem validation on this almost 2 years ago, actually, before we started any of this. Andy, you were part of that. And you remember, I mean, we got very strong feedback. Everybody had it was like Apple versus my Windows, or Mac versus or iPhone versus Android. I mean, like everybody had an extremely strong opinion, and it was very polarizing. It was like, talk to Philippe. I work in YAML and YAML only. I don't want any of this rule mode nonsense. Just give me the actual YAML, right? And then like the person you talked to, Matt, like YAML's for developers. Give me something I can understand. So that's why we've gone with this dual mode functionality here. So whether you use the fancy rule editor or whether you edit it in YAML, like it's all one and the same. It's just a matter of what's your preference and how do you want to work, because you can either use the nice UI and it updates the YAML live, or you can just edit the YAML, and that's fine too. And then on the back end, that'll go get stored somewhere, whether that's in Git or in the database. At that point, it doesn't really matter.
Okay, no, that's awesome.
Yeah, so that's really where we're headed here. And it should be, again, like from a internal GitLab perspective, Matt, as you all know, I'm sure, like getting MRs through that touch the database are really hard and costly. Like it's just a long process. We don't have a ton of database maintainers, and it's just not easy to make changes to the database. So just one other additional benefit to all of this is that we're able to kind of iterate pretty quickly on the schema here and figure out how we want that to be. And then when we do move to the database, it's going to be just one set of MRs to move it into the database. Whereas if we went into the database from the beginning, it would be like this constant stream of database MRs that would have really slowed us down. So we're gaining a lot of development speed by going this route too. Another thing that I mentioned is being able to view the policy history. So that's something else that we need to support. And again, so this is on our roadmap to add in to the side tab, but a change history log, because again, if we were no longer using that linked security policy project, we've got to provide some other way for users to view the history of all of the changes that have been made. So this is a step in that direction as well. And we'll need to make more changes here once it's actually in the database, but just providing a place to see this and view the change history is a pretty big step as well. So again, like these are mocks. This shows way more functionality than we have today, but hopefully that gives you at least some idea of like how we're slowly moving along towards getting to a point where this could all be abstracted away. And we actually have this item way down here at number 10 to hide the security policy project and automate the permissions. So before we move to the database, our intermediate plan is just to hide away that linked project so that the users don't even know it's there. They don't have to worry about it. They don't have to think about it. It's all entirely behind the scenes. And we have some initial thoughts about permissions there that you might be interested in, Andy. I mean, we haven't really made any solid decisions on this one just because it's so far out for us. But the general idea is that you would be able to set up the equivalent of like a security role where we've got developers and maintainers today. You would be able to have a instance-wide security role, more or less, where those individuals would be maintainers on all of the security policy projects across all of GitLab. That's sort of like the initial thinking, but again, we haven't really fleshed that out or finalized those requirements yet.
So the direction the Granular Permissions project has gone is essentially allowing users to create a fork of an existing role. So let's say developer. I can fork that, title it whatever I want, security, AppSec or anything, and then a la carte select and deselect, pretty much going through that list of features we have in our docs of permissions of what you want to allow them or not allow them to do. So I wouldn't see a problem with having that kind of like merge into kind of gating the security policies project, only in that it would be a project access would be the problem. So because it's thought of as the project access feature and specifying which project can be accessed isn't something that's on the radar yet, as opposed to who can do what within a project. So if this policies was a feature, which I think it is already, then that is easy to do.
Yeah, so it sounds like you could, where you're headed, you can manage that at the instance level or the workspace level or what have you. But yeah, you're right. For full feature parity with what we've got today, we would actually need those settings on the project level. So you could say, for this development project, who do I want to be able to manage the security policies for this specific project, and customize that list on a per project basis. I have a lot of thoughts about ANA because I've dealt with that a lot at previous companies. But yeah, ideally you want that to be a flow down model where basically the group inherits from the workspace and the subgroup inherits from the group and the project inherits from the subgroup. And then you can either set that to use the upstream setting, which is sort of the default, or you can override it, either to on or off for an individual on a per project basis is really the ideal way to go.
Yeah, we're working on that, like the inheritance of like least access, right? Like that theory. So it should work that way, as you can adjust roles by group, right? So you can give different users different roles depending on what group they're in, or they can inherit down. So I wouldn't see a problem with that right now. And the whole workspace thing is going to keep us on our toes, I think, for everything, especially policies and just permissions in general. So there's enough.
It sounds like what you're describing actually will work, because if you're able to fork one of the roles as you described and create like a security role, and then you can, assuming you can only apply that security role to specific projects, then that should address our needs. Like if you say this group of people, these 5 people, they're assigned the security role for all of the projects in this group, or this particular project, and you just add them to the project as instead of adding them as a developer or maintainer, you add them as a security reviewer or something. Whatever you name that custom role, I would expect that would meet our needs.
Yeah, it's essentially what you were mimicking with, like, the project owner or maintainer can only do these actions. And well, when we tried to say early on with the RBAC stuff was like, oh, just make security people maintainers. Everyone's like, no, you're not going to do that. So you're mimicking it. Is there a thought on when Workspaces comes out, how to transition away from a policies project? Or is that even on the radar?
So the transition from the policy project to storing all these things in the database, that has nothing to do with Workspaces.
Gotcha.
That is entirely independent. We are planning to use the work that the Workspaces group is working on when we introduce group level security policies. And that's actually the very next item on our backlog. That's right here at priority 2, add support for group level policies. So we have this all designed out, and actually we are just waiting. Their backend object that they're building out is called project namespace. And we are just waiting for that project namespace object to be available for us to build this out. So this is planned, but the work to make this available at the group level and subgroup level and workspace level, that all is totally separate and decoupled from the discussion of where do we store the policies.
The ideal solution to have one place to manage all policies for a user's instance or an org?
Yep, that's this. So we're planning to make it available at the group level and the subgroup level. And then once workspace is available in like what, a year or two, then it will be available at that level as well.
Okay. Yeah, that sounds great.
Because yeah, right now they're just building out that backend namespace object. So they're not even working on workspace right now.
Yeah.
A little bit confusing, right? So that team is building out the namespace object, and the namespace is an object that you can put code there that applies to groups, subgroups, and projects. So you can build it once instead of building it 3 times over. And that's a prerequisite on their side. So they need to get that in place first. And then they can introduce the new workspace object, which hopefully the code for namespace will apply to workspace as well. So it's kind of there's a long line of like dependencies there before that vision is actually realized. But as soon as that namespace object is available, we'll be taking the next step, which is to make these policies available at the group level. If that made any sense.
It does. Yeah, it does. I think because you can have multiple namespaces in a workspace. I think I've seen like diagrams of that so far at this point. I think one question that there's no answer to it, but something to keep in mind is when workspaces becomes available and this for all secure and protect, do we need to keep the same features that we have at the project and group level, or can we keep them just at one high level?
We definitely need it at the project and group level, 100%. That's not even a question, because each of the different projects require their own settings, and some policies you can easily just set it in an instance level and forget it. But some policies require project specific customization. So part of that we're addressing with like the way we're handling our policies. So like when we require DAST to run, instead of putting in all the parameters for DAST, so DAST is a great example, because like the URL that DAST needs to go scan is going to be different for each project that's being built. And DAST needs to authenticate and log into the app that's built. And again, those credentials are going to be different for every single project. And so all of those project specific settings are created at the project level in a profile. And then the policy just references a profile name. So as long as you have really good hygiene and you create like if you use the same name for these profiles across all of your projects, say it's called default, right? Then you could just go and say, okay, my group level policy requires the default profile to run. And then it's going to pull the project level settings, because each project has its own settings for the profile that's named default. So there are some things like that we can handle at a higher level and just have it up there, but it's going to be really hard for one set of policies to apply everywhere. For example, different policies are under different levels of scrutiny, like different regulation levels. I've heard, a lot of customers that have like, we color code our projects, or we classify them like high, medium, low, or, 1, 2, and 3, and those all have different levels of scrutiny. And I think we're going to have to continue to support some level of more granular customization, because some projects are just like developers threw it up there to go do a POC of something, and others are like, this is our main app that goes out to production. And it gets really tricky if you're trying to enforce everything at an instance level.
Makes sense.
Cool.
Same.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's like a visualization and like, did we check the boxes across all of our applications layer that sits at the workspace? And then there's the customization tuning for the specific needs of an application, whether it's managing PII or it's like fun with learning Git stuff. Like, you can't enforce policies straight down if it's just a project to like my project for my cookbook recipes. I don't need policies on that. But
yeah, and one thing I didn't touch on, but that we're planning as part of this is the ability to customize your policy rules to only apply to projects that have a certain compliance framework label attached. So we're planning to actually integrate tightly with that feature that the compliance team has built out, because there's a strong desire to classify projects and say, this project requires HIPAA compliance, or this project requires GDPR compliance, and this project over here does not. Like I said, if I'm just a developer and I'm just throwing around some test code, you probably don't even need to run any security scans, or require merge request approvals. Like, you don't need any controls for that, because it's going nowhere. It's just purely, a playground to test things in. And so, we need to be able to support that full spectrum of controls from nothing all the way up to, complete security. And we've got to give customers a way to classify those. So yeah, that's another thing that's going to help, is having policies that can be applied only to, projects with a given compliance framework label.
yeah, notice we're almost out of time. I think the last thing I wanted to mention was, do we as GitLab have a good definition of what is and what isn't a policy that belongs in this part of the application that does these certain activities versus what is a rule requirement for merge requests or something,
Yeah, so I really see, it's under the security and compliance header section. And I think the lines really get drawn around persona. So if it's a concern that the security and compliance team is dealing with, then it should go in here. If it's something that a developer or a DevOps engineer or someone who's just like trying to automate workflows in GitLab elsewhere, like when a GitLab issue is created, I need you to also create a linked Jira issue, right? That doesn't have anything to do with security and compliance at all. I've talked with like Gabe Weaver, there are like a lot of other areas in GitLab that could benefit from this kind of policy workflow management that have nothing to do with compliance. And so we're hoping to allow them to reuse what we've built here, but we do want to provide a good segregation of duties and a different user experience for each of those personas, because there is a pretty strong line there between what those roles and responsibilities are for. So that's really the defining factor, the principle, I guess, that we make those decisions off of.
That helps me. Yeah.
So yeah, if you're just saying like, okay, this code base requires backend approval if it touches backend code, that's on the development team, right? That's a development approval that they set up, versus like, I'm going to require the security team to review when we find vulnerabilities. That's very clearly a security concern.
Yeah, or stemming from the tree of their own internal policy that is in that branch of security or compliance, right?
Correct, yep. And there may be some overlap between the two. And I think that's okay. But yeah, we really see this as the home for everything related to that security and compliance persona. So even if we develop two ways to do it in GitLab, one for security and compliance people and one for developers, that's fine too. But that's the boundary that we've set for this area, is it's got to meet the needs of that persona. Otherwise, it doesn't belong.
I would think you would want to separate them as well, just from going back to the RBAC conversation. If they're in separate areas, you can permission them separately, because I can see that being a big problem for people not wanting to give developers access to the security policy controls just because they need to create a, like an MR approval workflow.
Yes, yeah, exactly. So like I said, there may be some overlap and we may end up with two ways of doing things in GitLab, and that's okay. Because the difference there, it's not two identical ways, like the permissioning thing, right? It's separated out by persona. So who knows, we may even let you just create generic merge request approval rules here at some future point in time. We don't have any near-term plans for that, but those can always be additive to the ones that are already in place. And to the developers, it would show up as like a read-only rule, right? Like, oh, I'm a maintainer, but I can't change this one because this was put in place by the security and compliance team.
Yeah. Yeah, it's almost like the concept is hindered a bit because the approval rules can be, did UX review this? Or is this meeting the standards specifications of our security guidelines? Very different things.
Yes.
Both called the same thing as an approval rule.
Yes. So anyway, that's generally where we're headed. If you haven't seen, I know we're way over time at this point.
That's fine.
Just double check. Oh yeah. So I'm still good to stay on for a minute, but
Hey, Matt, do you have, because I know we had this discussion before and we're like, oh, that sounds like we can just make it a policy now, right? And we've talked a lot about like settings and configurations and, vulnerability management-esque things. I guess there's a more clear definition now, or a line drawn between what is a policy and what is a configuration for vulnerability management, right? With this policy editor and this, yeah.
I mean, I'd say, yeah, generally speaking. So like perfect example, we're still looking at doing auto resolving by the system as something you would create through this policy builder. And I would kind of argue on the side of it is a way to enable what is or is not a policy of your department. So if you have a security policy that requires a human review before resolving something, then you don't enable the policy. If your policy allows it, then you can create this rule to let it go forward. But it is definitely a security concern, which is why it makes sense to put it here. Plus, it's a lot more flexible than shoving it into just another setting on the security and compliance configuration page. And that would be a perfect thing to sit at a workspace level and cascade down to every project and then opt out the ones that you do not want the auto resolve to be a part of. So I think this is definitely a direction I'd like to continue aligning with.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Just wanted to highlight this mock if you haven't seen it already. This is in the settings page where you set up your merge request approvals. And so this is what it will look like. We haven't quite done this development work yet, but it should be done fairly soon, probably no later than 15.0. So we're getting rid of vulnerability checks. So this line will go away. And then we're adding this new section down here for security policies. And you'll notice we list them so that you can see them all in one place, but you can't actually edit it here. And that's by design. We send you over to the policy editor if you want to make any modifications. So again, like we're doing this right now for vulnerability check. We'll probably do this as well soon for license check. Presumably we could add in support for any of these other approval rules too, and they would just show up down here as well. But like I was saying, they would just show up as like, okay, it's here, but I can't do anything about it unless I have access to change those security policies.
Really like the separation actually this creates between just a general developmental approval and the security aspect of things, or security and compliance policies, right? This makes the conversations with the teams that have been working on like another type of rule editor, or in Create they're working on approval rules, and the needs are similar, but if you look a level deeper, they're pretty different.
Yep.
I think having that separation it's a little more clear, right?
Yep. Like this is the persona. If you're this persona, you work here. If you're this persona, then you work up here, right? And you have visibility. So we're really trying to keep that whole shift left visibility mentality, which is why we're letting everybody developer and hire see all of the rules, and they can even, you can even open an MR and contribute. Like everybody can contribute, following all of our GitLab, philosophies here. You can always contribute to a security policy, but you can't actually approve it and merge it in unless you're part of the security and compliance group. So that's really the way we've intended it to be done and used, is like, hey, there's full visibility and transparency here. If you think something can or should be changed, go ahead and open an MR and write it up and write up your justification, but you don't have the authority to just go do that all by yourself.
Yeah.
Sam, so in that mock that you just showed, if we do the auto resolve like we're intending right now, making it another type of policy or another type of rule that you can create in the policy editor, would you see that showing up there as well in that security section? Or is that more just for the approvals?
This is under merge request approval.
Oh, that is just for approvals. Okay.
Overall heading. Yeah. So this is like if you come in and you go to settings, and this is where you set up your merge request approvals.
Right. Yeah, I realize now that was a silly question. Let me modify it slightly. Since I do like the exposure of just this is a thing that's here, is that something we should put in here or just keep that in the security? Maybe this is more a question for you, Andy. Like just keep it in the security and compliance section.
I would keep it in the security and compliance section, basically, just because how the system works. Like it's going to auto resolve once it no longer detects the vulnerability anyway. So it's not like you can do anything with it at the moment of time of being in an MR.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Okay. Never mind. That was kind of a silly question.
No, good question. We have a tendency to want to like put things and things with like things to have like consistency, or this end-to-end application that's all things to all parties. But I think the separation is needed now and will continue to be needed as we have built more of a vertical inside of GitLab for security and compliance specialties. I think the waters are still a little muddy, and which causes usability problems and which teams own what and which teams do what. And I think carving out a little bit of the territory for security and compliance is probably the best way to meet those users' needs and teams.
I agree. Cool. Hopefully this helped. Feel free to let me know if you have any more questions. Happy to talk through it some more.
Yeah, this is great. Thanks for doing this, Sam.
It was awesome.
Yep. Have a good one.
All right. Yeah.